Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on human-centered design for digital mental health. My name is Prof. Angelo Furiata, and I am co-PI of the MPhil project. Now, out of this project comes the West Africa Digital Mental Health Alliance, WADMA, which was born with the mandate to provide resources, education, and to foster collaborations for people and institutions passionate about digital mental health. We're thrilled to have you with us today as we explore how digital tools and innovations are transforming mental health care and support. In this digital age, technology has become an essential tool in breaking barriers to mental health care, providing accessibility, anonymity, and support across distances and demographics. Today, we will dive into the various ways apps, virtual therapies, online communities, and AI-powered tools are revolutionizing the way we approach mental health. Throughout this session, our experts will share insights, practical advice, and the latest trends in digital mental health, helping you understand how these tools can benefit individuals, caregivers, and professionals alike. Feel free to engage with us throughout the session by asking questions in the chat. We encourage interaction as this is a space for learning and exchanging ideas. Thank you again for joining us, and let's get started on this important and exciting journey into the future of mental health.
Lola, I think you're muted, and if you're trying to talk to everyone.
Oh, apologies. Good evening. My name is Dr. Lola Kola, and I would like to welcome us again to everyone in the audience to our webinar focused on human-centered design, organized and delivered by West Africa Digital Mental Health Alliance, WADMA. WADMA is funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, USA, and hosted by University of Ghana and University of Washington in Seattle. WADMA's mission is to foster the next generation of digital mental health leaders in the African region. Our group provides training and support in the conceptualization of digital mental health interventions. We offer consultation and development of research projects involving technology, and we conduct studies that creatively use digital platforms to improve access to mental health services. WADMA membership is open to all career levels, just to remind us, including students and professionals interested in digital mental health. I thank you again for joining us. Please sit back and enjoy the event.
Anna, are you going to do another introduction, or should I just jump right in?
You can jump right in. Thanks, Jamie.
Oh, okay, sorry. I thought we had one a bit more preamble. Okay, let me get my screen sharing figured out. here. Okay. And I'm going to ask you, am I in presenter mode? Do you see full slides?
Looks great.
Great, wonderful. So I have the privilege of kind of kicking off our session today. As Angela introduced, the topic of our presentation today is human-centered design in the context of digital mental health. So I'm delighted to be here with the WADMA group. I'll be presenting today with my friend and colleague, Seth Asafo. Seth and I are among a great group of folks led by Dr. Angela and Dr. Dror here in Seattle and in Ghana, working on a digital mental health project. I'm going to leave it up to Seth to share some of the details of that later in the session. Today, my job is to provide an introduction to an approach to technology design called human-centered design. This is a framework for creating digital interventions that we incorporated into our project and that I use a lot in my own work. So hopefully I'll get you excited about incorporating these principles into your digital mental health projects. And along the way, I want to provide you with some concepts, vocabulary, and details about human-centered design process that I hope will help you connect with the lived experiences of the folks you're designing for. Ultimately, I believe this approach leads to more useful and usable end results. And learning about these principles, even in this short session today, can help you collaborate with designers and technologists like me. So let me introduce a little bit about myself, including how I got involved in digital mental health projects. I'm an associate professor at the Information School at the University of Washington. If you're not familiar with information schools, we really study and work at the intersection of people, information, and technology. That kind of is everything. And that means that we're a really multidisciplinary group. Many of us are deeply committed to collaborative, interdisciplinary projects. So I use a collaborative design process to probe and explore the ways we can use technology to communicate and coordinate, especially in contexts where people with very different background, training, and experiences are trying to connect. I was originally trained in visual art and design, and then I got a PhD in information science and technology. That focus on visual communication has really carried through all of my work. I use a lot of visual methods in my research, and I'm really interested in the ways that visual representations of information and experiences can help support collaboration and coordinate and communication. This work and these interests really led me to do studies in a range of really interesting and different contexts, including public engagement in science, and most relevant here, the long-term management of health and mental health conditions, collaborations with clinicians, patients, and caregivers that often happen after or sometimes before acute crisis. I've worked on teams looking at self-tracking for people with bipolar disorder. I work with pediatric nephrologists seeking to create tools to support collaborative decision-making. And I work with colleagues at UW exploring ways to support young people experiencing the first signs of psychosis. And of course, the project you'll hear about more today, working with faith healers in Ghana to improve the quality of care they provide to people with mental health issues. I want to be really clear, I'm always upfront about this. I am not a clinician, but I think that the types of coordination between clinicians, patients, and caregivers in all of these contexts are examples of the types of collaboration that really interests me. It's the work of connecting and collaborating that happens in the midst of daily life when we're all coming from different directions, but we're really motivated to work together. I'm usually brought on teams like the Ghana project to guide the design process, and I really enjoy doing that work. I like the applied nature of the projects. I like sharing the design process with my collaborators, the ways that the design process can support clinical work. And I love learning about the different areas of care and treatment that I get exposed to through these projects, which is why I'm here and why I'm excited to engage with all of you. So I'm going to jump in and get started with the main content of the session. So I'm going to start by giving a bit of an overview of user-centered design. User-centered approaches to technology have become the norm over the last 30 or 40 years of developing and designing computing systems. I know I just said that this talk was going to be about human-centered design, but bear with me as I go back a bit to set the stage for how we got to where we are today. First, it's just some basics. Two primary components that we talk about when we're in the process of designing technology are user interfaces, sometimes called UI, and user experiences, sometimes called UX. If you're being trained as a designer of technology, like my students and the work I've done, I worked in industry for a bit, it's highly likely that you will refer to yourself as a UI UX person. So that's your first special vocabulary. If you hear someone refer to UI UX, that is a shorthand for a specific part of the design process that focuses on user interfaces and user experiences. So when we hear the term user interface, we might think about a screen or a monitor, the way we interact with our phones, our tablets, our desktops. 50 years ago, though, in the 1970s and early 80s, it was much more typical to interact with computing systems primarily through command lines, text-based exchanges of command and response. Today, most of us are much more familiar with modern graphical user interfaces, sometimes referred to as GUIs or GUIs. That's the desktop or home screen that is displayed on our monitors or our handheld devices. One of the things I want to emphasize here is that many of the interfaces we use to interact with complex computing systems, like our phone, right, are based on visual metaphors. Folders, files, trash cans, even icons displayed in a neat grid on what we call our desktop. These were designed to help us navigate a digital world that is purely numeric. Those interfaces continue to change as the hardware and software that we use is evolving, to the point now where we have things like smart speakers that don't have a visual component to it. We interact with the computer system through speaking. We even have brain-computer interfaces that are being developed that actually embed the interface, the point of connection between us and the computing system inside our own brains. These are really changing our expectations for what an interface is and can be. And as computing systems have gotten more sophisticated and become more integrated into our lives, we sometimes refer to that as pervasive or ubiquitous computing. That means it's everywhere. We don't limit it just to that screen, that point of entry. As these systems have become more ubiquitous, and as the numeric models we have for representing those systems have gotten more nuanced, think generative AI, our focus has really shifted from the digital innards to the inner workings. To the inner workings of these systems have really receded into the background, and we've turned more attention to our interactions with and through computing systems in the context of our lives. This is what we refer to as user experience design. Now, designing user experiences is certainly not new. Just look at the history of architecture or interior design. But seeing not the engineered system in and of itself as the primary output of our design process, but instead thinking of the experiences, the pathways, the modes of interaction and engagement introduced and facilitated by and through technology. This is a notable shift in how we see technology design, what our jobs are as technology designers, and what is within our responsibility, what's possible. This shift did not happen overnight, And in fact, hints of the importance of this user-centered design have been around almost as long as computers. User-centered design as a concept, as an approach to design and engineering focuses on the needs of users throughout the design process. So we don't just wait until the end. We don't just give the product when it's all said and done. The goal of user-centered design has always been to create products, services, and experiences that are functional and desirable, that are usable and useful. I'll return to those two words repeatedly throughout this presentation. We're looking to make experiences and products and services that are usable and useful for the user, not in contrast, solely determined by the computing machine itself. In fact, user-centered design can be traced back to the practices of design thinking that were very first discussed in the 1950s and 60s. This was articulated by Herbert Simon in his 1969 book, The Sciences of the Artificial. He wrote this book as a summarizing, theorizing, kind of thinking through this time in the 50s and 60s when the field of information science, the birth of information technology, the surge of computer science brought together engineers, mathematicians, psychologists, and cognitive scientists, even artists. There were a lot of really interesting programs in those early days that brought together scientists and artists to not only develop these new tools, but to try to imagine the depth and breadth of how these new things would and could be used once they got launched into the world. It was a time that the fields of engineering and design were really closely entwined. And this is what Simon's book sought to theorize, this new world of computer engineering and interface design. Technically, Rob Kling is credited with coining the term user-centered design in 1977. However, the term gained popularity after it was featured in Don Norman's 1986 book, User-Centered System Design, New Perspectives on Human-Computer Interaction. Norman went on to be a really influential designer at Apple. He also wrote a book called, originally called The Psychology of Everyday Things when it originally came out in 1986. By 2002, the title of that book in a later edition was changed to The Design of Everyday Things. Jeff Raskin was another really strong voice in advocating for intentionally designing computers to be easier and more enjoyable to use. This idea that the computer should adapt to us rather than us having to adapt to the computer was really articulated deeply and well by Raskin. He also played a really large role at Apple during the late 20th century. And in fact, Raskin's book was one of my first exposures to these ideas when I was just starting to work in the web development industry around that time. So before we get to the evolution of user-centered design to human-centered design, I promise I'm gonna address that. I want to go back for a second to Herbert Simon's book from 1969. He wrote something really important for understanding how we ended up where we are right now in terms of technology design. He wrote that to design is to devise courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. This describes an intervention. And this is one of my favorite definitions of design, not because I completely agree with it, but because I think it pushes to the surface questions that are fundamental for understanding human-centered design. Interventions, whether clinical or in the form of technology, are created by interjecting something, by changing something, by adding actions and activities, introducing an interface or an experience into an existing situation with the intention of altering what is happening, what is perceived. Simon's definition of design requires us to take a human-centered perspective because immediately to do anything with that, we need to ask, current state for whom? When? Where? What's the context? And preferred, what is preferred? What's a preferred way to be? Preferred for whom? Why? Under what circumstances? In order to design an intervention, we need to address those questions. Specifically thinking about digital mental health interventions, we see a really interesting merging of technological and clinical intervention. We have apps delivering psychosocial education. We have digital tools for supporting self-tracking, like the ones I've worked on related to bipolar disorder. Electronic health record systems that seek to support more collaborative decision-making. AI and large language models systems that have the potential to ease bottlenecks and provide more personalized care, especially promising in situations where access to in-person care is harder to come by. We even have social robots to ease depression and isolation. And I love this one. Just the other day, my 11-year-old son was telling me about researchers that he learned about on YouTube exploring the use of brief exposures to video games like Tetris to break into intrusive thinking for people with combat-related PTSD. I did look that up. I didn't just take his YouTube reference. That is a relatively new study that has come out. I believe that this merging of the technical and the clinical requires a holistic perspective. It requires a human-centered design approach, which brings us to what human-centered design is. So in 1989, Mike Cooley, who was an engineer, academic, and activist who thought really deeply about the relationship between human skill and technical functionality, what humans do well, what computers do well, coined the term human-centered technology in his book called Human-Centered Systems. A few years later, in 2002, David Kelly, who was a founder of IDEO, which is still a massively influential design consultancy responsible for many of the products and experiences we associate with innovation even today. He spoke at a TED conference on human-centered design, bringing the concept into the mainstream. Related to that, around 2005, the Stanford Design School, often called the D School, opened its doors and became a similar force in how we think about design, process, and innovation. The shift to human-centered approaches to the design of technology is a shift from seeing individuals simply as consumers, as users, to seeing them as people having holistic human, social, and cultural experiences. So we're shifting away from defining the people in these systems as solely as users to seeing them as humans who operate within complex systems. So the first principle of human-centered design is to shift from thinking about users to thinking about people. The second principle involves making choices and decisions about how, when, and where to intervene that acknowledge and consider the complexities of human experiences. It sees all of the messiness of the world around us, all of the overlapping, imperfect systems that are influencing us all day long, every day. I intentionally picked these two images of a busy urban street and a busy emergency department to emphasize the fact that when we think about technology interventions, when we think about applications or tools that we are putting out into the world, this is more like what we're going into rather than a lab or a very controlled setting. So human-centered design embraces this complexity. Human-centered design also focuses first on learning about the context, these messy contexts in which people live, work, and play. Human-centered designers don't start with a problem. They don't start by saying, I have an idea, I'm going to design an app. They first ask, what's happening in this situation? Who plays an important role in what happens here? Not just the end user, the person who's going to hold the phone in their hand. Who else is influencing things here? Why do things happen the way they do? In asking these questions and taking a contextual approach to understanding the system, understanding not just the symptoms of challenges, but the root causes, right? In doing that, human-centered designers identify both challenges and opportunities, problems and potentials. They locate possible points of intervention based on what is needed, what might be possible. Last, ultimately, a design is only successful if, as I've been saying, if it is both usable and useful for the people it was intended for in the context for which it was created. As I was saying, ultimately, we continually test and refine ideas with stakeholders all along the way. I'm going to talk about this more next, how this actually plays out. So I've gone over the idea of how we even got to this idea of user-centered design. I've talked about how that idea of user-centered design involves interface design and user experience design, and that how over time, as our computing systems have become ubiquitous and pervasive in our lives, we've shifted from thinking about the only people that we care about as the users of the technology to recognizing that human experience and the ways that these systems interact with our social and cultural worlds is more complex and can be quite messy. So we have these principles of thinking about people, taking a systems perspective, thinking about context, and continually going back to gather feedback from the people who are going to be most affected by the systems that we're designing. What I want to do with the remaining part of my time is actually get a little bit more concrete, right? We can think about design, we can think about the philosophy of design, but that's not necessarily super helpful when we're trying to get up and running with a design project with a lot of moving parts, like in digital mental health. So what I want to do is lay out some steps and stages of designing human-centered interventions. And again, remembering I'm thinking about those interventions as this entanglement of technology interventions and clinical interventions. I'm going to break this down step by step and give you some examples. This isn't just enough to kind of introduce some of these ideas. At the end of my presentation, I have some resources where you can go deeper into all of this. So first, let's start with learning the context. I've talked about this a few times already. When we think about learning the context, one of the first things we do, we conduct interviews, we conduct focus groups, we talk to people. We might do contextual observations. There's a technique called contextual inquiry that is a particular approach to interviewing people as they go about specific tasks. You pretend to be an apprentice learning to do their job. You shadow them. You ask a few clarifying questions along the way, and then you reserve some time to wrap up and double check with those people that you're observing that you understood what you saw. That's called contextual inquiry. Once we do interviews and focus groups, contextual observations, we're also doing what we call in the design world desk research. It's also in research land, it's called lit review. We're learning about the context. We're learning as much as we can about the context. We're ready to do what's called a stakeholder analysis, right? And as I mentioned before, we think of stakeholders not just as the user, as the person holding the phone, right? But we're thinking about the group of people who have the ability to influence, have an interest in, right? Are impacted by the introduction of the intervention. I want to pause here just for a second and say, at this point, so we went from users to stakeholders. Stakeholders is not without controversy as a term. There are some people who resist that term because of its association, again, with consumerism, with shareholders, with capitalism. I think that it is actually a good term to emphasize the fact that when we think about people who have a vested interest, people who have a stake in a situation, it encourages us to think about all the investments and commitments that we have as people in social contexts. When we are looking at stakeholder analysis, I've provided just 2 examples of ways that we organize what we've learned when we're doing that user research. The image on the top is a very common diagram outlining people in terms of their power or their influence, their ability to encourage a use of a intervention of a product. Along the lower edge, we have levels of interest in the project. I might be using a psychosocial education app on my phone on a daily basis in order to learn about the early psychosis of my loved one. I have a high interest, but I don't have a lot of power necessarily to distribute that psychosocial educational material within an existing organization framework or treatment center, right? So I might be reliant on a lead clinician, right, to really have high influence in introducing that app, even though that person might not be a daily user of the app. That's kind of how we think about stakeholder analysis. And the circular model in the lower part of the screen is a similar idea of core or primary stakeholders, secondary and tertiary stakeholders, those people who are influenced by the use, but maybe aren't going to be interacting with it continually. So once we've learned about, another tool that we have, another set of tools we have available to us to capture what we learn during this first initial phase are what we call personas. These are 2 examples of personas. They're really profiles. They're capturing patterns of what we heard from people, different types of stakeholders that have some commonality that we want to really be thinking about in a holistic way. Making up these kind of characters, summarizing across a number of different interviews, using forms and formats like this is a really typical, often used tool. Other tools that we have are scenarios and use cases. These are more narrative summaries, examples of day in the life of how things happen within a given context. It helps us synthesize, it helps us make sense of all of the details that we are hearing as we're going about making observations and talking to people. So ways to make it concrete, kind of concrete containers for that work. The next step in a human-centered design process involves generating ideas. And this happens in a couple different ways. We think about requirements gathering. This is making a list of the things that an intervention will need to do. When it comes to user requirements, what do our end users, what will they need this to do? If it's a population that is not super familiar with technology, one of the user requirements will be that the tool will be simple to use. Interface requirements might span from things like branding or integrating into existing systems and look and feel, right? It also could have to do with accessibility and having the interface function in a way that people with visual impairments are able to interact with it. We don't know how we're going to do that. We just know at this point, we just know that it needs to happen. We also have system requirements. If we know that it's going to be a mobile app, right off the bat, we can make some a catalog and inventory of things we need to keep in mind. When it comes to a human-centered approach to concept, developing ideas, developing design concepts, I often use techniques that are called co-design or participatory design. I don't have nearly enough time today to get into all of the details of what that involves or the methods. That might be a topic for a future WADMA presentation. But the bottom line is that we bring stakeholders to the table, to the design table, before ideas are fully formed in order to get their feedback early on at a fundamental stage of concept development. Often this involves face-to-face interactions. Things like focus groups are a good model if you're familiar with what a focus group is. We often use paper and pen to make things accessible, quick, and flexible. And really the idea is that the stakeholders that we invite to the design table are experts in their own experiences. And we want to tap into that expertise. We want it to be, to influence how we come up with ideas for interventions. At the end of this phase of the human-centered design process, we have design concepts and mock-ups. Now, these might be paper and pen, right? We have something called paper prototyping that is very typical at this point. I included an image of a wearable that's made out of paper that you actually physically kind of slide through to see the different screens. The idea here is that before we invest the time and money in developing a digital platform, a digital tool, we play around with the idea of how this thing exists in the world, right? We get some feedback, we get buy-in. There's a lot of research that shows using these materials that are informal, flexible, changeable, can really help people feel invited into the process. It can make them feel like they are able to influence what's happening, that it isn't a done deal already. So we put a lot of effort during this time in creating a sense of openness and a sense of collaboration. Next, once we have an idea of what we want to make, what we want to build, we want to make those ideas tangible. We do this so that we can show feasibility to or for key stakeholder groups. We want to try to make it seem real so that we can start kicking the tires, right? We can start testing out to see what might happen when we actually set this off into the world. There are two main tools for making things feasible, tangible, sorry, that I want to focus on today. One has to do with something called information architecture. Now, this is something I used to do in industry. It involves mapping out in various ways the content and functionality, the experience of interacting with the technology, with the information delivered through the technology, mapping that out and really looking at the flow of information. It's a tool of information design. It is, we often call this wireframing. The example on the left and the one on the top on the right are example of wireframes. This is not what the designs will ultimately look like. It's not about the look and feel. It's about the specific information, the specific series of buttons and clicks and actions that will be taken as somebody interacts with the system. Sometimes we also create a flow chart like the one you see in the lower right-hand corner. This captures the whole arc or trajectory of what's going to happen as someone interacts with a system. This is a process of reduction. We've gone from this messy, human, complex idea of the context, and we're starting to slowly create a structure around it, but it's a structure that is based in human experience and what we are learning about how people are making sense of the world, how they're moving through the world. So in making ideas tangible, there's an element of designing the information, designing the interaction. Then we also have this idea of prototyping. A prototype is a version of the idea. It's a version of a thing that's not complete. But often we do have something we're trying to figure out. I often think of prototyping as a feasibility test or a proof of concept. Is there some part of this design that we want to test out that we maybe are unsure about? So we want to get ahead of it. We want to make that go a little bit deeper into what the interface might look like, how the data might be gathered and transferred somewhere else. We might be interested in privacy and security. So our prototype of the system might focus on how we're going to protect people's data. I've included this diagram. This is from an article called "What Do Prototypes Prototype?" The point of this article is that when we create a prototype, whether a low fidelity, a medium fidelity, or a high fidelity, and I'll talk about those terms in a second, we have to make choices about what part of the system are we going to prototype? Because if we did everything, it wouldn't be a prototype, it would actually be the system. The prototype is there to help us figure out the details along the way to accomplish the large by a series of smaller, more controlled steps. We talk about, in this article, they talk about that we can prototype the role something plays, so we can prototype how it's going to actually get integrated in people's everyday lives. We can prototype the look and feel. We can mock it up. We can create what it's going to feel like to hold it in your hand. We can also prototype the implementation, which is more of that technical implementation. How is it actually going to connect up with a digital network that is already existing? So what this looks like in practice, we have low fidelity prototypes like the ones I've already shown that often are paper and pen, right? My students are always surprised at how much they can learn by going and just doing a quick paper prototype. We then also have tools for starting to flesh out the architecture and what people will actually see when they interact with it. There's a very powerful tool called Figma that's readily available. It's a web-based tool that will help you create these medium fidelity prototypes pretty quickly and easily and cheaply. So that's a starting point if you're thinking about prototyping an app or something like that. Checking out Figma as a tool for that. And then we have more higher fidelity, reaching into the higher fidelity prototyping that really is trying to get a greater sense of how this thing is going to exist in the world. All of these are examples of higher fidelity prototype that focus on the hardware and combine look and feel and implementation. So once we have made the ideas tangible, we've gotten some buy-in, we have gotten feedback from stakeholders, we've gotten user feedback through making it feasible, then we're ready to test. This is really more formal usability testing to see if we've gotten it right. Again, we're asking the question, is it useful? Does it actually help people do something that they need done? Is it a meaningful intervention? We can think of things as being daily usefulness, right? I need to check my email every few minutes. I have text messages every few minutes. These are activities that in order to be useful, they need to be able to be on the move, right? Then I have things that I only do maybe once a year. I need to pay and file my taxes, right? I need to, what's another? I need to prepare for my kid's birthday, right? Things that happen just every now and then, but are critically important. And he will vouch that his birthday is critically important. So we think about those in terms of useful. In terms of, is it usable? That question has to do with the ease of use. Does it make sense to me? Is it intuitive? Do I get frustrated using it? I can have a tool, like a tool that helps me with my taxes, that it's very useful, right? So I'm going to use it because I need to, but it might not be very usable. It might not be a pleasant experience. It might not be an easy experience. The sweet spot that we're looking for with human-centered design is that it is both useful and it is usable. And it's not something that I have to adapt to. Ideally, the system adapts to me. The ways that we test include user feedback. Like I said, we've been doing that all along the whole way. We also have more formal usability testing. The tools that I've shown here reflect the more formalized instruments that have been developed over time that help us assess and measure how usable our technology interventions are. The scale on the right, or excuse me, on the left is the user burden scale. This is a scale that was developed by folks here at the University of Washington, and it's designed to assess a series of questions that are designed to assess whether an app or a website, some sort of technology, information technology tool is too difficult, too much of a burden on users in order to be useful and usable. We also have the system usability score. That is another set of questions that you can use in order to measure the usability of your intervention. I have a whole list of them linked to at the end of this presentation. The University of Washington Alacrity Center, which focuses on supporting researchers in implementing using the design process to implement mental health interventions, has a really great library of a lot of different usability instruments that can help you. We also, though, in human-centered approaches to technology design, also observe and talk to people as they're using digital interventions. This can surface key issues, and the field of human-computer interaction has a number of highly validated assessment tools and instruments. And like I said, there's a link to those later in the presentation. As I've been circling back to a few times, one of the key principles of human-centered design is connecting with and collaborating with your key stakeholders throughout the entire design process, not just during formal usability testing. We talked about how we can do this all the way in the beginning of the project through the context study and interviews and contextual inquiry, how we can involve community members in the design process, how we can make ideas tangible in order to gather user feedback during development as we're going through the iterations of getting it to launch. After we've completed usability testing, we can also go back to stakeholder partners. We report out and share what we learned and how it worked. This is really important. I often do community engaged work. And one of the core principles of community engaged research and design is that even if the results are not entirely what we expected or even wanted, the effort to share results is an important way to help make sure people feel like true partners. And it can be an important step at the conclusion of community engaged projects. Too many times, especially researchers tend to go in, they helicopter in, they drop an intervention, and then they're out of there. There's no follow-up with community members. So it can, by taking this step to share the results with the people that you've worked with or with community partners in general, it can mitigate feelings like researchers are not really there to truly collaborate. It really reinforces this idea of partnership and is an anchor to the human-centered design approach. So just in summary, a little bit of a recap. We talked about the human-centered design, designing human-centered interventions as a series of steps, each of which involve people in the process, stakeholders in the process. When we learn about the context, we learn about how people experience the world. When we generate ideas, we collaborate to find meaningful points of intervention. When we make ideas tangible, it allows us to iterate using feedback from stakeholders. It allows us to have a concrete point of focus for those conversations. When we test our ideas, is it usable? Is it useful? We're asking that about the people who will be using it. Then we share the results, we share successes and failures with partners and other stakeholders. So that's what I have this morning. I do have this slide. We can share these slides with a list of a lot of the references and resources that I mentioned throughout my portion of the talk. I also have a link to my research studio website The QR code here goes directly to the publications page, which has a lot of background articles, examples of some of the things that I've talked about. It's almost up to date. It's about 6 months out of date. I have a few things that I need to add to it, which I'll get to this afternoon. But at this point, I would love to hand things over to my colleague, Seth Asafo, and he will walk us through how we took a human-centered design approach for a digital mental health project.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I'm also going to put up my slides and then we'll take it from there. So I'll be looking at the practical steps that we took to be able to use the principles of human-centered design in the development of this intervention we have called the MPhil. I must say this is the official title in the publication, which I've shared in the reference section, which is a digital toolkit, MPhil, to improve care and reduce human rights abuses against people with mental illness in West Africa. So this was the user-centered approach that we took. This is the overview, the background, what the MPhil is, and the walk through the application. Also looking at how we develop the application and how we continue to test and retest. And I'll be drawing on a lot of the knowledge that's already been shared by my colleague, Jamie. I have a different understanding of the human-centered design. And just to make it very simple, there's a before process, a during process, and an after process. And most of these ideas go into emphasize what Jamie was talking about, like learn about the context. It's important to have information from many different sources as you learn. The team formation is also necessary. Now, in human-centered design or in any kind of design approach to solving problems, they'll tell you that the more different variations of people and expertise you have, the better it is to understand the problem in depth and therefore come out with solutions that are more feasible in a sense. Now, that same stage of before also bears into mind some of the information. That's the literature reviews section. Like you're gathering information that already exists about the situation. And then you come into, after you gather all that information, you come to the place where you're making sense of that information and looking at how that can be translated into creating an intervention. Now, once the intervention is created, it goes through a rigorous process of testing and retesting and modification. Now, the human-centered design assumes that you can't solve all parts of the problem at once, but you can solve some of it. And so they'll tell you that there's no problem that is solved in entirety, but you can gradually solve it. And sometimes it may take some time to actually solve the problem. But at the end of the day, if you're reducing the burden of the problem, that is always a plus. So this is the background. Now, within our context of mental health, we do know how many people who have serious mental illness, they struggle a lot. And if you look at low and middle income countries like Ghana, there are many challenges that makes it even more difficult for people who have serious mental illness to get care or to get the best care. Some of these are structural, some of these are human resource based, some of these are fiscal based. And all these things are important in looking at what interventions that can be put in place. So in Ghana, beyond the economic and access barriers, many people also use faith healers. So faith healers have become the go-to point for a lot of people who seek interventions for mental health challenges. And healers often share belief systems that psychopathology is spiritual. And of course, if you look at Ghana as a very religious country, it makes sense why these things happen. So many faith healers adopt prayer or engage in specific rituals, sometimes fasting or even offering certain sacrifices in the way of dealing with people who have mental health challenges. Now, healers typically, as we know, don't have, let's say, formal training like we conventional, and I use the word conventional reservedly, mental health practitioners do have. And so the traditional and faith-based care is not uniform. So sometimes it's very difficult to find a scientific or empirical base for treatment, as it were. Now, healers seem to offer some sort of psychosocial benefit. So, for instance, when people preach, they might help alleviate the feelings of fear in some people and even help foster a sense of hope and optimism. So yes, they do play a part in what we do. So what challenge were we faced with for which human-centered design became a core for us to develop the MPhil app? Now, it was noticed that in spite of the benefits and some practices associated with care by faith healers, human right abuses or violations were also consistently present. And some of these were in the form of chaining, forced fasting, sometimes marking, and even sometimes physical harm being meted out to the people. So this multinational team collaborated and tried to make sense of, so what can be done in this process. Now, in the sense I mentioned that there is a before phase that looks at the information that we gather. And these informations are also from our stakeholders, as well as information that we gathered as academics or academicians or clinicians. And there were a number of leverage points. So there is something that can be utilized to help in this alleviation. That was technology. Now, one of the leverage points was the fact that if we use the healers as a leverage point, you can teach them basic psychosocial skills. And in a study by Ofurata and also Guraji, it showed that healers were open to learning alternative approaches to the treatments they had. Now, the second leverage point was also that in mHealth is that if you improve the care of patients by using smartphone technology, you can also expand access. So there are a number of statistics that shows that the penetration of smartphones within the country, Ghana, is really high. So that becomes a leverage point of an intervention that can be used through that medium. So partnering with healers was to develop and assess a digital toolkit that would be designed to support the dissemination, so to teach them evidence-based psychosocial interventions. And these interventions are largely what we would typically use as psychologists or mental health professionals within our conventional, and I still use that reservedly, conventional mental health settings. So the idea was to identify and design requirements to prototype a toolkit, which would be delivered through the phone, and to create it and test it, gather information, and then, as Jamie said, share that information to partners and also use that in the modification. So in the stages of the MPhil development, we conducted a number of first individual interviews with healers. We did the group co-design sessions. We had the intervention content development and programming that has to do with the actual technology. And then we also looked at the preliminary usability testing of the beta version. So the version before the actual one was made, to find the challenges that might exist. And then also to have healers have a feel of it and then give us some feedback. Now, this was a participatory research in many regards. So we had interviews with a number of healers, 12 in all, 10 males and then 2 females. So all participants were Ghanaians and they had an average of about 43 years. The healers in the study, they also varied in position. Now, that is necessary because when you're doing any kind of design approach, it's always good to gather information from a broad base. And so the healers could have been the leader of the camp, or they could be members who were offering various services within the camp. That way we know the ideologies are also different, and the way they understand the context of mental health and interventions or the ways their healing approaches work will also be different. Now, at least 2 camps use observable forms of forced fasting. That was necessary because we had wanted to work with dealing with the human rights violations that usually occurred within the prayer camp settings. Now, in the individual interviews with healers, interview questions focused on understanding the healers' current practices, the needs, the assessment of situations that led to human rights abuses. And it's been quite interesting that a lot of the faith camps that we work in will tell you how they do not put people in shackles because they want to, but that's their way of restraining the person. And that makes it helps with the kind of intervention that you develop and deploy through the smartphone. Now, interviews were audio recorded with permission. We had to follow a lot of ethical guidelines, and these were transcribed. In the co-design phase, we had about 12 participants also. Now, the objective of this session was to collectively ideate, to generate together and assess the feasibility of the design direction. So that was information that we required to design the app. Now, my colleague Jamie mentioned the user interface, and that's a very critical aspect of deploying an intervention, especially through the use of a smartphone. So how easy it is may actually push people to use even more, and also the experience that they gather. So she talked about UI and then the UX designs, and these are very critical. So it's something that we had to do together, and I'll come into that a little more as I proceed. Now, all participants were Ghanaians with an average age of 45 years. All but one participant has participated in the previous qualitative interview. So there was a point we had interviews with different healers in different camps to gather their information. And also, like I mentioned, that was to gather how they went about their duties, what usually necessitated training, all of that. Now, once all that information had been synthesized, we had the co-design group, which was the focus group for all of them coming together, where we discussed this even more. During that facilitation session, we had a number of our team members, one based in Ghana, one based in US, who asked the questions, and these were translated there and then. And then the team members would agree if the translation basically depicted what they had said, because some of our healers spoke only Twi and not in English. So we also had available other team members with expertise in participatory design, which is Jamie, and an MPhil app content development also that was present as we went through these developments. So what did we learn during the group design? First of all, participants were introduced to what MPhil is and provided a background information on what we propose to do with this particular MPhil technology. Now, the participants were asked to evaluate, and feedback is a very important process when you're designing. So in human-centered design, feedback is a very essential process. So participants were asked to evaluate and rate the aspects of the MPhil intervention model, the intervention content, intervention modalities, and design preferences, and rate them. And I'll show you a few videos. So for instance, we showed them a number of photographs of how the app should look, and they'd select, and the majority of them would say this might be better than the other. And I'll show you some of those pictures that we had. So participant numerical ratings informed the rapid synthesis. So based on what they preferred, the app was developed in a sense. Now, as Jamie had mentioned, in human-centered design, let's not forget that the app is made for the human. So for the people who use it, they are the core of development. So their feedback or their preferences were very important for us. Also because we would say that they formed a good sample of people who were in faith healing. Now, there were a number of things that we considered in the process of doing the whole co-design. And Jamie was talking about sometimes you look at the primary level of the people who actually use the app and compared it or moved further to people who might not actually use it, but would have an indirect impact on them. So for example, when it comes to the faith healers or caregivers, a number of focusing questions were localized around the fact, how can we better understand the decisions, values, cultural practices, and anticipated outcomes related to the care of people with serious mental illness? How does mobile technology play a role in their daily life? Which behavioral health strategies would be most helpful? So at the back of our mind were these burning questions for which we developed a co-design session to gather more information as we fed the process of developing the app. Now, for the camp staff, there were questions such as, how can we better understand the work practices, the values, the cultural practices, and the biggest challenges related to caring for people with serious mental illness? Then on the secondary level, we look at people like academic researchers. So a focusing question there was something like, what are the biggest challenges or barriers to improving the quality of life for people with serious mental illness in an under-resourced country such as Ghana? And I will try to, I'm trying to move a little fast, so I'm not reading all of them. Now, on the tertiary level would be, for example, residents receiving care in the camp. So what is the daily experience of a resident with serious mental illness living in a prayer camp? And then for the family of such a resident is what factors into, like, looking at whether cultural, health related, safety, economic factors contributed to the family bringing their loved person to the camp who had serious mental illness. Now, these were pictures of us as we did the co-design. Let me see if I can pull out this pointer. But in the far right corner is a hotel that we had signed and got the conference room where we got the healers to come to. Now, we tried as much as possible not to do it within a specific healer setting to allow for everyone to feel comfortable. And also, it was convenient for us. And this is Professor Draw and myself as he, asked the questions, and then I translated into the local language. Before our two other pictures of interviews that were done with healers prior to even the co-design, where we had the focus group discussions. Now, below on the first level are pictures that we showed. And so here we showed these to healers and we asked them specific questions. Do you think this content would be better received if it were in a comic strip, or whether it was actual human beings that were giving out the information? And they rated all of this that also fed back in the process. And there were photos and pictures that were showed to them also, for which they would say, we prefer this, or this might make more sense to us. So the whole process was not individualized, but it was something that we did together as a group. Now, once this was done, an idea had already been formed. And in human-centered design, in as much as you're trying to ensure that, or you actually do make sure that whatever intervention you are developing is for the people, it doesn't mean that you can't have a motive way ahead of time. So you could have a structure of what you want to do, and then you work in the process with the stakeholders or the people who would use the intervention to get even more sensitive information. Now, so after this was done, model scripts were initially developed by members of our team who are clinicians with expertise in providing care for people with serious mental illness. So there were 4 members of the team that took a crack at it. And after we had developed the content, we had shared it among each other, looked at it, and then shared it with the larger group. And our team is a large group for people to give us feedback. So then the intervention model scripts were then circulated among all the team members for people to give us input and content. And one thing that we looked at very critically was culturally sensitive wording, so that it didn't lose the meaning of what we wanted to say, or that it would sound condescending, which would make our healers feel that perhaps we didn't value their input. So those things were really important. So following appropriate modifications, we created a brief digital animation video depiction for each MPhil intervention script in collaboration with a graphic artist. In parallel, we made sure that these were done in both English and Twi, which are the most common languages in Ghana. And I'm sure that with time, we might move ahead and do even more languages. Now, audio recordings were then added to the digital animation video so that users could select their preferred narration language for each intervention. Now, I remember that when the app was developed initially, it was all video-based. And as part of the process that within us internally tested, we had thought about the fact of adding an audio version that speaks a little deeper to the context that was created from the video. Now, after usability testing, this was conducted to assess the perceived usefulness. And Jamie mentioned a lot about testing whether the app is useful, whether it fills in the gap that it's supposed to. So this was done, and it was done with 12 participants, 11 male, 1 female, from 5 camps that participated in the usability testing. Now, here we had a semi-structured interview that was so the interviews were recorded and transcribed, and we tried to get information from the people who were using the app about how the app how it was or how they felt about using. And there was a strict questionnaire that was developed to ensure that we gathered all that information. So participants were asked a series of open-ended questions about the experience navigating the tool, the design preferences, and also assessing content in 4 different domains. So the app had a domain for human rights content, relaxation content, verbal de-escalation content, then CBT therapy skills content. So the research team focused on evaluating app content, interactivity, information design, and navigation. And like Jamie had said earlier, you cannot test every aspect of it. So these were the aspects that we tested as part of getting the app ready for the larger study. So participants also completed a number of feasibility assessment tools that were rating scales that gave us objective measure of what the app was like for them, if they had any challenges, and so on. Now, what did feasibility assessment, what did it teach us? It taught us that the MPhil app would be most accessible if it was developed to be deployed through smart mobile devices with multimedia players that can deliver content in modalities other than just written text. So here about video and then audio. Now, the content that undermines, so it became necessary for us to look at wording and context, because any content that would seem to negate the spiritual beliefs of the intended healer users or attempt to bypass them altogether would mean that they would not use the app, and that the app adoption would be difficult. So those are things that we figured out during that feasibility assessment. In addition to the more typical illness-focused mental health interventions, what we did was we ensured that the app had a section. So in as much as there are a lot of apps that look at interventions that are deployed via mobile smart devices, but we made sure we had a context, or the app made sure that it had a section that was for human rights, human dignity, and also safety training. So now let me take you through what the MPhil app is. Now, MPhil is a mobile health program designed to train healers to deliver evidence-based psychosocial intervention while maintaining safety and patient dignity in practice. And I'll run through this a bit and give you a feel of it. Now, it was designed in collaboration with healers in Ghana, and the essence was to deploy some of the interventions we use in the general conventional mental health settings to people, faith healers, essentially. And these were done in Twi and English. And this is just some of the interfaces, but let's look at it. Now, whenever you open the MPhil app on the start page, and this is the icon, the green praying hands is the icon for the MPhil app. It starts with a welcome video, and the welcome video basically gives you, it welcomes you and tells you the context for which this app was created. So I'm going to play one of this so we can just listen and see what it looked like.
Was created for people like you.
Please let me know if you can hear.
To try and help people with mental health problems. You are providing a service to your community, and many people seek guidance from you. The MPhil app can give you some helpful ideas and suggestions that you can add to the work you're doing to make sure the people you treat can really benefit from all you have to offer them. Not every skill will work with every person you meet, and you may already know some of these skills, but the more you learn, the more skills you will have to help people. You are invited to use these ideas and create your own skills and to share with others. Practice the skills before you use them in real life. The more you practice, the better you will be at them. You must consider the privacy and safety of those you are helping. Think about a safe and secure place where you can practice these skills. Perhaps that is a place outdoors with open space, or a place indoors away from windows or dogs who may bite. We hope you will find MPhil to be useful in your work, and that you can visit the information again and again whenever you want to. Good luck in helping others.
Okay, so this is the welcome video to MPhil app, and there's a Twi version. I just don't have it loaded up, so I'll make do with this. Now, I want you to keep in mind that the interface you see and the way it looks, it's something that the healers had selected themselves. And so these were not we didn't impose on anyone. It went through that rigorous process. And so what you see in terms of the graphics is what they had chosen. Now, the MPhil has what you call prompts that would normally tell a healer to remember to watch a video or listen to an audio or check in on their patient. And I will talk about the check-in feature later. Now, on demand is that when you open the interface, this is what it looks like. And you'll see 4 different tabs. Now, we did a number of things to ensure that even for people who were not literate, they could still make sense of the app. Why? We had, first of all, a logo, a writing, and a color. And every time we did a facilitation training, we'd say, so you can look at the dove and consider peaceful, or you can look at the hands with that plant as being relaxed, or you can use the color as well. And for those who could read the dialect, directly read on that. So that was the process. Now, I'm going to highlight just one of the modules, which is the Peaceful module. So the Peaceful module contains 5 videos and 5 audio files that describes how to approach and interact with someone who's aggressive. Now, mind you, in the time when the interviews were being done, researchers, our research team was also gathering information about the difficulties they face. And so the app was developed specifically with the challenges they face as a way of helping them to be able to intervene with their patients. So this is, I think, the first video on the Peaceful, and I'll just play a bit of it and then I'll move on to the next.
People who are behaving aggressively, like kicking, screaming, or spitting, can make us feel like we are under attack. When we feel attacked, it is hard to stay calm ourselves or to make the best decisions. Before you react to a person who is acting aggressively, take a moment to calm yourself. Take a slow, deep breath. Then ask yourself, why is this person so upset? Could they be afraid of me or something else? Maybe they are confused. Is there something you can say or do to help them feel safer? When people feel safe, they calm down more. This may give you some ideas about helpful skills to use.
Absolutely. So you notice the videos that were created and the audios were quite short, so we could sustain attention, but it gave out very specific interventions of things they could do. Now, for the same video that I played, there is an audio that's attached, and the audios gave more information and went in depth to teach them, as I would say, the science behind why the intervention would work. And I'm going to play one of them that comes from my phone directly.
It is not easy to stay calm if you feel scared or unsafe because someone is upset or angry or acting in an angry manner. Our brain tends to recognize these emotions as danger and prepares us for a danger, even if it's not so. As a result, you may behave differently when you feel that you are in danger. Can you recall a time when you or somebody you were working with was behaving aggressively? What were the behaviors you observed? Were they kicking, screaming, spitting, or throwing things around? If you stay calm, the people you work with will feel and copy your calmness. A quick way to stay calm is to take a deep, long breath. Taking in deep breaths slows the action of your heart and allows you to feel calm. Bear in mind that when we are upset, we tend.
So this is what the app is. So the videos are there, you have the audios as well. Now, the Relax module also has 5 videos and 5 audios that describe specific relaxation techniques. But because we don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to play them. But obviously, if you ever need to feel the app, the Department of Psychiatry, you can always visit our research office. Our research coordinator will be more than happy to take you through it. Now, I mentioned how we focused on the human right module. And so we created a number of videos that gave information about human rights. And I want to play one of them so that you can feel the kind of psychoeducation that came out of that.
If you believe in the Holy Bible, then you know Jesus. Jesus helped the sick.
Is this audible?
Was compassionate to those
This one is quieter, Seth.
similar to Moses today. Jesus treated everyone with patience, honor, and
Breathing in a much faster.
Can you imagine Jesus deciding to treat someone who was sick? Can you imagine Jesus ignoring
It's quite on the low.
Okay, so this is the video, but I will play out the audio here.
Physical harm. Today is a good day to examine whether someone can be released from the chains. Take a few minutes to think about this. From all the people you are currently treating, is there someone you believe who is doing better? Someone who has calmed down enough so that they do not need to be shackled. You can walk over to the person and see whether they appear to be aggressive or dangerous to you or to others. In most cases, even when people are saying unusual things, it does not mean that they are dangerous. Maybe this is something you can say to calm them. I would like to see if we can release you from these chains, but I am concerned that if I do, you may try to hurt me or other people. Do you think it's safe to remove the chains? Can you promise me that you will not try to hurt anyone if I unchain you? If the person agrees and seems calm, you can approach them. You can say, I am going to release you now. Please try to stay calm. We can work together so that you are safe and other people are safe too. Do you agree to that? If the person agrees, you can release them and say, what can we do to improve how you are feeling? What can I provide to you to make you feel safer? If the individual requests something like more food or water, try to provide it for them. This will show them that you can be trusted and want to.
So you have a feel of what that is. Now, the MPhil app was also developed to allow for healers to be able to track their patients. And the essence of tracking was, first of all, would be that it becomes habitual. Now, being habitual means that they would use the app more often because every time they open the app to track their patients, they may be inclined to look at a video or one video or listen to an audio. In the same light, they become more interested in their patients because they'll be genuinely interested looking at how they're doing. So we had an approach for checking in with your patients, and it starts this way. You can add a patient with the as we develop the app with the healers. We noticed that if we use numbers instead of having them use words, it make more sense because not all of them had formal education. So the numbers made a lot of sense. And they put the icon to record a name or a designator to allow for them to recall who's been saved there. Also, they help with issues of confidentiality. So once you pick the number, you have the option to start a recording where you could put the patient's name. And then once you recorded it, it would add that person onto your base of the information. Now, once you do that, you have the check-in feature that's created where you can come in every day and check in on them. And as you can see from the slide, the icons or the emoticons you see, green signifies that they're doing much better. Yellow means, well, they're in the middle, and red means they're not doing really well. So once you come to check in, that's something that you can do. Now, on the back end of the MPhil app is a place that's for administrators or our steady officers who are able to look at the information about how often the healers are engaging with the app. That helps for us to be able to say, okay, they actually are using the app. And so if it's translating into the benefits, we can now ascribe it to the app, which comes back to the effectiveness that we do. So what are some of the potential benefits? For healers, the ability to acquire new evidence-based skills to practice, the ability to track their patients, and also the hope that it would reduce chaining practices. Then for patients and also future patients is that there could be improved illness management, reduction in days being in chain, improvement in psychiatric symptoms, and also a general improvement in their quality of life. Now, the MPhil research team currently has developed a two-pronged approach where they use the MPhil and a mobile nurse that offers pharmacotherapy within a select number of camps within the country. And so it's part of the process of we keep testing this. We do fidelity and feasibility assessments where healers give us feedback about what the app has done. Now, in one of those interviews, I remember a healer had told me how the app had helped him so much because now the way he communicated, not to his patient, but to his partner and other people had improved, and he was finding that very empowering. And that is an amazing success story. So after optimization, we had done this in one of the camps where we had 4 healers use the app for a 2-month period, and then they were assessed on a number of measures. We also looked at outcome measures for patients using different tools, and also looking at the days of change, days in which they had been in chain. So the trial currently is ongoing. It's an NIH-funded research grant. It's collaboration between University of Ghana and University of Washington. And we are still in the process. We're using a step wedge approach where there will be random sequential crossover of clusters. So at some point, everybody will go into the intervention arm, and then we can check the results and see if this is something, if the app actually is as efficacious as we have seen it to be within the pilot study. So expected outcome, that this app becomes a valuable new tool to treat people in Ghana and other West African countries with mental illness, and that patients at prayer camps will receive more evidence-based care and human practices. These are photos of some of the sites that we visited, just to have you have a feel. And in participatory research, this is very important. And if you ever need to read about this, this is the reference for this particular app development. It's being published, and then you can gain access to it. You can always contact our coordinator to share a copy with you. This is our current team made up of psychologists, psychiatrists, community nurses, and design. And I mean, there's a range of professionals. I can't state all of them, but know that everybody in there is playing a part in ensuring that this app is doing what it has to do. Thank you very much. And if there are any questions for us, we're happy to answer.